Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode with Filip Holm. Welcome for the first time to my podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm very, very excited to have you here. I've been following you and your work for a very long time. And as I shared before, it was when I was in my religious studies and had a certain master's course that I found your channel, Let's Talk Religion, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And it was during the time when I was writing a small paper on the tradition of Sufism and wrote about the practices and the meditations that are used in that. And we will get into that today. And I think it's really exciting that we're talking about this for the very first time on this podcast. And as I told you, it's been over 5 years now of recording this podcast. So I'm just excited to have a scholar like you. Could you maybe share a little bit about yourself and your background and your beautiful YouTube channel?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, thank you for. I'm honored to be the first guest to talk about Sufism, I suppose, and I'm very glad that my content was helpful when you were studying. So I'm based in Stockholm, Sweden, and I've studied the field. I have a master's degree in the field known as Comparative religion, is what we say in English, religionsvetenskap in Swedish, sometimes just religious studies. And I studied primarily at Södertörn University. And so within that wider field, I specialized in Islam and even more particularly on Sufism. And I wrote both my bachelor's and my master's thesis on West African Sufism in particular. So as you probably know, in that academic world, it's sort of you have a focus and then a focus within, and then like your niche can be crazy specific. And since then, I have focused primarily to this day on online education, because I also have a background from my the Swedish equivalent of high school, gymnasiet. From those days, I studied media production and film, and so I had a background in filmmaking and editing. And so at some point, I had that sort of light bulb moment back in 2017, 18, that I could combine my studies in religion and my passion and interest in that with my background in filmmaking. And so I started the channel called Let's Talk Religion. And that's been my main occupation and my main focus, at least within this field and aspect of my life since then. And it's been incredibly rewarding and fun and just a privilege.
That's amazing. You do make incredibly beautiful videos and it's so easy to watch, and you covered so many topics. You almost have 1 million subscribers. So yeah. It's a amazing source of wisdom and knowledge. And I was really, like you said, you have I mean, it's a wide spectrum of different videos that you have on and different religions, and then the Sufi ones were really helpful for me to also get a broader understanding of the history and all of that. So I would definitely, I'm linking it in the show notes as well, and I can definitely recommend it to everyone who wants to learn more. And you have you have videos on religions in the ancient Near East and Christianity, Judaism, Kabbalah. You have also within Hinduism and Buddhism and all of those. Like it's a spectrum of videos.
To keep it broad. Thank you for the kind words, and I mean that's one of the fun things about it is the fact that I have the freedom to study so many different things. So if you're, I mean, academia is wonderful, and I love that. But when you're in academia, you often have maybe a single project or two that you're working on for years within a single very specific niche field. Whereas for me, I can really explore all kinds of topics that I feel inclined to or that I'm interested in. And really what I'm doing is, at least for many of my videos, is that I am learning too as I'm making the videos, and it's like more that I'm sharing something that I'm excited about with the audience. So it's a lot of fun.
That's amazing. And on the topic, maybe people don't know really what Sufism is. Maybe we can just give a brief introduction before we go deeper. But I also wanted to ask you what sparked your interest in that, because you can see on your YouTube channel that you're traveling to different countries. You covered a lot of different practices, and is it also how do you call it, like branches as well? But maybe people who don't know what it is, just a short introduction, and then also your journey into it.
Sure. So Sufism, in Arabic, it's called tasawwuf, and it's often referred to somewhat simplistically as Islamic mysticism, or the mystical side or aspect of Islam. I don't have that big of a problem with that definition, although, if you really want to go into it, that you can nuance it and so on. But so what it is essentially, I sometimes call it a tendency within Islam, or an aspect of Islam that seems to have grown out of in the early centuries of Islam, especially in and around modern Iraq and also Iran, where there seem to have emerged these individuals who lived renunciate lifestyles, somewhat ascetically, really wanted to dive deeper into the inner meanings of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, and focused on, on top of course, following the outward practices of the religion, they also turned inward to try to purify the soul and come closer to God through certain, as we will get into, certain practices and certain, there emerged a kind of vocabulary around it, certain practices related to what we could call, in broad terms, meditation, music, that helped the soul on a kind of journey towards intimacy and even union with God. And this was done through this initiatory, you could say, structure where a sheikh, sometimes called a murshid, would teach a student, a murid, and guide him or her on this path. Tariqa is often called, right? It means the path in Arabic. And so it seems to have emerged very early on in the Islamic civilization, and it eventually grew, especially in the later Middle Ages, around the 12th, 13th century. It really became part of mainstream. It was mainstream Islam, right? So the wider complex of Sufism was something that basically every Muslim, almost every Muslim at least, was part of in some way. Not in the sense that they were necessarily initiated into a Sufi order, everyone, but they visited the graves of the Sufi saints. They revered the Sufi masters that were living, and the ideas of Sufism and how that affected the theology of Islam, that became also part of mainstream theology. So it was a hugely influential movement throughout the history of Islam. Now, my relationship is interesting. I didn't know about Sufism until I started studying religion academically, or I kind of knew about it. And this is part of my journey, I suppose, because as a kid, I would listen to a lot of music, and among the music I would listen to, it was Qawwali music. So I would listen to Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. I listened to, I don't know if that counts as Sufi music, but like Youssou N'Dour from West Africa and that kind of music. And I didn't know that was Sufi music. I didn't know what Sufism was, what Sufi music was. But I was interested, and I really loved that kind of music. and I had been exposed to certain ideas, I guess, through that, or philosophies that I didn't connect to this tradition called Sufism either. Although I always was interested in, as most of us are, in the sort of big questions in life, and religion and mythology that always really fascinated me. I have one example when I was in high school and we studied film again, and we were tasked to make a short film. And I wrote this movie, or this short film, about a therapist, someone going to a therapist, and the whole conversation was about God and religion. So clearly I had an interest in that early on. And to make a long story a bit shorter, eventually I started studying religion at university, and I choose to really study Islam and get into Islam for various reasons. I'd grown up in an urban area of Stockholm where that was very multicultural, and so I grew up around people from all kinds of national and religious backgrounds, many of them Muslim, whom I love very much. And when I got out into the real world, so to say, I realized that people had a lot of strange opinions about Muslims and Islam that didn't sync up with what I had experienced. And so it was partly just a general interest in the Middle East and in the so-called Muslim world, and also this sense of, I want to learn about this tradition, this religion, so that I can have proper conversations about it, because I feel like the conversations are on a very very low level. And through that, when I started getting into Islam, I learned about Sufism, and I discovered, well, I know this already. I know this music, I know some of this poetry. So it was really a kind of a natural fit that I choose to go deeper into it. And then, as is often the case, the more you study something, the more you become interested in it, both academically, but also, I would say, on a personal level. I've always had a great love for, especially the sort of aesthetic and the aesthetic expressions, like the music and the poetry, and many of the philosophies I always found them very beautiful and appealing. So that's very shortly my story, you could say.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. It's great to hear about your experience and your background, and to understand how you have got so deeply into what you're sharing on your channel, and that wisdom. And it makes sense how if you've grown up with a certain culture around you, you have a different insight into it than just studying it, and then you travel to these countries and see like how people are living and practicing. And also, since I'm hearing that you are pronouncing Arabic words very well, have you studied Arabic and read texts in Arabic as well?
Yes, I studied Arabic for just 1 year at Stockholm University, and then studying Islam and Sufism, you also pick up some Arabic along the way. And then my wife's family is actually Iraqi, so from 3 kind of directions, I've at least to some degree, I think, improved my Arabic over the years. Thank you for that.
Amazing. That's I could imagine that could also in the long run in your studies, like, it's always I talk about language a lot on the podcast, because I think it's interesting how languages, since I grew up bilingually, and English is also my third language. It's interesting to see how when you try to translate certain things, it's really hard from like one language to another sometimes, and expressions. So when we're studying things, religions, societies, it can be easy to understand. Like the language is a key somehow, and also a vibration. And I'm thinking about, as you were speaking, the Sufism, I don't know how it came into the West, but it kind of, from what I've understood, is some of the practices have also been disattached from being associated with Islam, just as yoga has been disattached to different Hindu traditions and texts, and that's a important, like, how did that process happen? And we'll get into deeper, like I wanted to also ask you what was the core of the Sufi, because it is interesting how when Islam spread, that in a particular area, was it because that area had already certain practices and beliefs that that form of Islam grew? And what was the distinction between that and Islam in other areas?
It's a very good question. It's a question that scholars are still debating a lot. I think there is certainly a probability that the existing practices in the areas into which Islam spread affected the way that Islam was practiced, or the particular forms of Islam that emerged in those areas. The fact that Sufism seems to have been so strong, particularly around Iraq and Iran and wider, Central Asia. Some people think that they connect that to pre-Islamic Central Asian, Persian traditions like Zoroastrianism. There's a lot of imagery of light, for example. I'm personally somewhat skeptical of that connection, but I think certainly that there are certain aspects that must have affected it. Another point of contact that I am personally more convinced by is the meeting that the early Muslims would have had in this area with the Syriac-speaking Christians and the monastic Christian communities. For example, one of the great Syriac Christians from the 7th century, Isaac of Nineveh, when we read his poetry, a lot of the imagery is almost taken directly, or it emerges, or we can find it in Sufism later on. So this idea of polishing the mirror of the heart, for example, we find this in some of the Syriac writers, and this is like a key concept in Sufism. So for sure, I would say that at least parts of why Sufism seem to have grown in this area has to do with already existing, tendencies and traditions that existed there, whether that be the Christians or the Zoroastrian or Buddhist or whatever that may be. It's hard to know exactly and to trace, precisely what comes from. Later on, when Sufism developed a much more philosophical side, it's clear that influences from Neoplatonism is there, as well as Hermeticism, and as you probably know, as Sufism spread to India, for example, there are great interactions and influences with the yogic traditions and other general traditions in India, and the sort of interactions between Sufis and yogis is a really fascinating topic. As for your first question, there are different perspectives that one can consider in how Sufism and Islam have been sort of separated to some degree, at least in some parts of the world and today. Sufis and Muslims have been in this part of the world for a long time. Traders would go to Venice and so on. So Sufis have had a presence in Europe and the West for a long time. But the first time, we usually consider the first time that a Sufi teacher comes to the West with the specific purpose of teaching Sufism to a quote-unquote Western audience is the Indian Sufi master Inayat Khan, who passes away in 1927, so just about 100 years ago. He comes from the Chishti tradition, which was prominent in India, and he's given this task by his sheikh, his master, to go to the West and spread the light of Sufism through his music. So he's a musician. And so he goes to Europe and America and he preaches, you could say, or he teaches a form of Sufism, especially in the later parts of his career, that is increasingly separated from, not entirely separated, but its connection to Islam is de-emphasized, you could say. He teaches Sufism more as a kind of universal spirituality that is strongly connected with Islam, but isn't necessarily connected with Islam. That, you know, non-Muslims could become initiated into his order, and that it was a path that could be walked by anyone, regardless of particular religious affiliation. So that was an important moment for that, and that was picked up by a lot of thinkers in Europe, just like yoga became also separated in a similar way from Hindu traditions in the 20th century. That's one aspect. Another aspect is the approach or the attitude towards Sufism and Islam in Western academia. So Orientalists back then would study the Middle East and Islam and Sufism, and they came across these beautiful poems, for example, like Rumi's poetry, or Hafez, or maybe Ibn Arabi. And they read these poems, and they were so beautiful, and they talked about love and beauty. And because of the prejudice that a lot of them had toward Islam as a kind of fundamentalist, strict and rigid tradition, they thought this can't possibly be the same thing. This Sufism must be something other than Islam, or at least something that exists in spite of Islam and not as part of the religion. And so Orientalists also started to separate when they talked about Sufism and Islam. So this is true still sometimes. You go in bookshops or libraries. This was the case at Södertörn University when I studied there. I don't know if that's the case still, but it said Islam and Sufism as one category, right? Which is understandable, right? But it comes from this idea that they are, while connected, somehow two different things. So that's another aspect. And then within Islam, from the especially 18th and 19th centuries, there emerges these modernist, you could call them, or new movements, which is often referred to as Wahhabism. This is a movement that is founded by a figure called Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in what is today Saudi Arabia. And he has what we today would call a very fundamentalist approach to Islam, a puritanical. He wanted to get rid of all the aspects of Islam that he saw as being innovation or that didn't belong into his very strict understanding of the religion. And so Shiism was out, of course, Sufism was out, and this movement, the wider aspect of which is often called Salafism, has become incredibly prominent in the Islamic world for various, political and other reasons over the last couple of centuries. And they have seen Sufism as something foreign, as a sort of innovation, as superstition, as, at worst, heresy. And so there's a sort of three-pronged attack on Sufism's relationship with Islam, one from within the sort of Salafi, Wahhabi camp, one from Western Orientalists, and then, of course, from within certain Sufi teachers themselves who interpret it more in a more universal sense. And this becomes very popular in the 20th century. And so Sufism is people like Sufism in the West, perhaps just like it stood alongside like Buddhism and yoga for a lot of these countercultural movements in the 20th century, but it wasn't always seen as necessarily connected with the religion of Islam, which was again seen as the sort of rigid fundamentalist thing. So, and we still see the results or the consequences of that today. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, very well. And I'm just drawing parallels to what we studied in the religions of India and Hinduism. First of all, the very various ways of practicing and how it was labeled as there's, I mean, at the university where I studied, we call it Hinduisms because there's so many different aspects and practices within one country, actually. And then an important and very interesting aspect is one, the colonial impact of how Hinduism was portrayed in the West, and then how interesting it is when it becomes like this universal thing, a little bit conformed when it's exported out. What it seems like it was an era 100 years ago when many of those that came needed to like adjust it a little bit to make it more accessible to probably Christians in the West as well. But it's also, to me, interesting that most Muslims don't are not familiar with Sufism or what it is, and then some people think that it's like it's Sunni, Shia, and Sufism, but that's not the case. So I don't know how because I mean it did, if you trace it back historically, it was around the 800s, right? So it's very very early. I mean, it's not something that branched off later, but it was something that was always integrated. But you have studied it from different parts of the world, and like Rumi, we can get into like the Sufi poetry. How I'm trying to understand, since I haven't studied it as deeply as you have, but how come the practices spread out? Maybe we should start actually speaking about the practices, and maybe those that are also very different from other ways of practicing Islam.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned before, Sufism or Tasawwuf, and Tasawwuf is Arabic and it means something like to become a Sufi, you could say. It's one way of translating that. It was seen as this path of purifying the soul, essentially, which was taught by a sheikh to a murid, a student, and you go on this path through different stations. This is known in Arabic as maqams. And this involved practices, as you say. Always, the prerequisite was that you practice the outer aspects of the Sharia, at least historically, before this separation happened in modern times. You would pray 5 times a day, you would fast during the month of Ramadan, etc. Often you would be asked to do even more of those exterior prayers as well. So you would fast not just during Ramadan, but sometimes you would fast continuously or several times a week, or you would stay up at night and pray continuously. So a deepening of the already existing Islamic practices is one thing, but as you mentioned, the practices that are more unique to Sufism in particular are practices that are aimed at this process of purifying the soul and of working against what's known in Arabic as the nafs. And this is translated as soul sometimes, or as self, or ego, lower self. And they can take different forms. The most universal and common one is something called dhikr. And this means remembrance. And the purpose of this is, as the name suggests, is to remember God. So sometimes the word is dhikrullah, remembrance of God. So to forget about yourself in a certain sense and to remember God. And this is done in different ways, but the famous way that it's done in Sufism is that it's often done in group settings. So Sufis in a certain order, or there are companions, will gather together. They will sometimes sit in a circle or sometimes stand up, and they will recite the Shahada, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, or sometimes certain names of God, so Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, and they will say these phrases or these names like chanting, basically, over and over for long periods of time. Sometimes this is done very loudly, very intensely and sometimes accompanied by certain movements of the body. Other times, like for the Naqshbandi order, which is one of the major orders today, it's done silently. So inwardly, you will. There's one practice, for example, called dhikr qalbi, which is the dhikr of the heart, and it's the practice is basically that you sit in silence and you listen for your heartbeat, and then imagine that with each heartbeat, the heart is saying the name Allah. Right, so that's one example of a silent kind of dhikr. And this is practiced by basically all Sufi orders, this general idea of dhikr. Although, again, it can, as I mentioned, it can take different forms. So that's one. Another aspect that is very common in Sufism is music, or it's called sama in Arabic, and this means listening. And this often involves recitation of poetry, but with the purpose of listening to that poetry, for example, and that poetry and the beauty of that poetry will elevate your soul, and it will take you into hopefully into a kind of trance state. This is known as wajd, it means ecstasy. And this recitation will often be accompanied by music, sometimes by musical instruments. So they will listen to music, sometimes there will be dancing or movements of the body that accompanies this music. The most famous example of this is, of course, the so-called whirling dervishes in Turkey, which is associated with Maulana Rumi's Mevlevi order. But there are many other forms of that as well. This has been a more contested topic or practice because the status of music within Islam has been controversial. You know, some Muslims historically have considered music to be haram or forbidden. Others are more allowing of it, and so the same is true for Sufis. So some Sufis think that this practice is inappropriate. Others have it as a very important and prominent part of their spiritual program. So, as an example, and perhaps surprising, it was surprising to me, Ibn Arabi, one of the great Sufis, while he seems to think music in general is permissible, he thinks that it's inappropriate for Sufis to engage in sama, whereas in the Chishti order in India, the practice of music and qawwali is like one of the most important and central parts of their Sufi practice. So it varies. And then I would say other various types of meditation, which could fall under the wider category of dhikr, but there are more specific kinds of meditation involving breathing techniques, again, this listening for the heart, and practices of isolation. So when a Sufi has reached a kind of advanced state, one of the more advanced practices that is only allowed if a sheikh deems you to be worthy is that you can go on something called a khalwa. And this means a seclusion. And this means you will go sometimes into a cell somewhere and you will be in seclusion just meditating and praying for the classic amount of time is 40 days. And this is sort of one of the most intense things that you can go through. So that's also one of the more prominent practices within Sufism. Yeah, so that's what I would say. That's the ones I can think of right now, at least. And as I mentioned, what's so fascinating about Sufism is that it's often, I don't want to use the word influence, but it's shaped, of course, by the local cultures that it sort of engages with and that it encounters. And so, especially for the music and the sama, you will have this sama, this listening to music and dancing sometimes in all aspects or parts of the Islamic world, but it looks very different in West Africa compared to India. And so in India, you have qawwali music, which is distinctly Indian in character and in flavor. In Turkey, you have like the Mevlevi whirling dervishes, and the music there is very sort of Ottoman classical music. In Morocco, you have this beautiful Nawa music and other. So while the sort of core of these practices remain, they take different forms. And again, the core of the practice is this purification of the soul. The goal of sama, when you listen to this music, it is believed that music, in a philosophical sense, the beauty of music and the harmony of music is a sort of reflection of the higher beauty and harmony of the divine. And so when you hear music, that reminds the soul of its higher origin. It's a taste of, in Islam, there's this tradition where God creates us. He asks, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And we, as souls who don't exist yet, say, indeed, you are, and that's how we are created. And so I think it is Rumi that compares all of the universe. He says that all of the universe is a dance to the music of that first command, either Alastu bi rabbikum or the kind kun, be, when God creates the world. And so so when you hear music and when you dance, you're sort of connecting to that original state of union with the divine. Your soul is reminded of its origins, and music, of course, as we all know, it has this ability to take you out of yourself sometimes, and it's very powerful. You can completely lose yourself in the music, and this to them is used as a very powerful tool for the soul to enter this higher state of, hopefully, ecstasy, where it can experience this union with God. Yeah.
That's beautiful. It's so clear when, I mean, that's why it's interesting to study different religions, because there's so many parallel practices. When I'm thinking about the practice in Sufism of chanting, for example, the 99 names, I mean, that's also very prevalent, chanting the 1,000 names of the goddess in certain Hindu traditions and Tantra. And then what that does to you, because it's different ways of focusing your, I mean, I love that that the names can invoke an understanding, and that's something that I wanted to ask you, because certain traditions focus on the dualism and the separateness, and other traditions focus on non-dualism. Is the Sufi practice both, or and how have you seen that?
There's really a spectrum, I would say, in the approach. Sufism tends to, and again, I don't want to make this distinction between Sufism and Islam as if they're two different things, but let's say Sufism compared to non-Sufi Muslims, Sufis compared to non-Sufi Muslims, tend to have more of a sort of monistic approach. The classic example early example is Halaj, who he has these poems that express this idea of the oneness of all things in God, and he famously exclaimed, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth, I am al-Haq, which is one of the names of God. And so that's definitely a common theme throughout the history of Sufism, although at the same time there is a spectrum. So on the one hand, you have someone like Halaj, or perhaps most famously Ibn Arabi, who is famous for this idea of wahdat al-wujud, the oneness of being. And his idea is that God is all that exists, and everything is simply an expression of the being of God. The whole world is a kind of reflection, a manifestation of these names of God. And of course, there are 99 names mentioned in the Quran, but to Ibn Arabi, the names of God and attributes of God are infinite. And so whichever way we turn, there is the face of God, as the Quran says. There is nothing but God. So there's that side, but then other Sufis will think that that's heretical, because there is a separation between God and creation. And Ibn Arabi would affirm that there is a kind of distinction, that it's complicated. But so on the other hand, you have someone like Al-Ghazali, who is often considered the most, I should say Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, the older brother, who is considered one of the most, quote unquote, orthodox Sufis in history, and he seems to have a much more dualistic approach, right? So where there is a much more emphasis on this distinction between us and the divine, or the world, and God. Although sometimes it could also be that they are speaking to different audiences, and these more esoteric, higher secrets of reality is not revealed to the mass audience, for example. It's hard to know, but there is a spectrum, and there are definitely different approaches to that, and that also has a major role to play in the practices like dhikr, because to Ibn Arabi, who I mentioned, all of this in the world, as I mentioned, is only the names of God, the attributes of God that are reflected, that are manifested, and it's kind of similar to it's a bit Teutonic, although there is also a difference there. And so the whole universe is a macrocosm that contains the infinity of God's attributes, that is sort of reflected, and that's unfolding. I sometimes say that the universe is the unfolding of possibilities inherent in infinite actuality, and that's the macrocosm. And just like in Hermeticism, for example, the human being is very special because it's the macrocosm in which also all of the names are contained, but in a contained form, in a single being. And so when we do dhikr, and when we invoke the names of God, we are not just speaking to this God outside ourselves who have these names, we're also sort of embodying and invoking these names within ourselves. So when we say Ar-Rahman, Ya Rahman, oh, the merciful, that is a way of also, you could say, awakening or embodying that attribute, that divine attribute of mercy and compassion within ourselves, and to connect to that name, right? And so the names and the attributes are very interesting. And I would love to know, because you clearly know more about different yogic traditions than I do, if there are similar ideas there as well.
Yeah, so I mean, in these traditions, there's certainly different aspects of, especially what I've been studying of the Divine Mother, different names, and definitely it can be different attributes, it can be different stages of life. They have different names, but I heard it so beautifully by one who has written about the 10 Mahavidyas, and she said, even if you say one of the names, like Kali, for example, and then you have a completely different aspect or name of that same energy. It's just like when we have a role and a name in different parts of society. You can be called mom, you can be called doctor, but you're the same essence. So I think that's what's beautiful. And when we chant, of course, we invoke that essence within ourselves. And I think that's like the more contemplative way. But it's also, I mean, there's so much non-dualism and dualism. Sometimes you are having that emanation of the divine as something that you have a relationship to, but also like how you embody it. So it is really interesting. And I love chanting and mantras and sound and frequency. And as we said, like the language is really a key, and the languages. And I think that when we have chanted, prayed, done all these practices for so long, there must be some vibration and frequency and intention that sets in motion. And that's one of the things that maybe you have you looked into the dervish practices of Kurdistan as well? Have you
Not
seen
as
what
much.
they do? They're chanting with their hair out. The men have really long hair.
Yes.
Have you seen? Yeah.
Yes.
And I mean and the movement it's just when we practice yoga or do like intense breath work, what it really can set energy in motion. It's like the body being activated, the energy body, and then you are so focused when you do it over and over again. And I think that's like the same thing that happens when you focus in the Sufi traditions as well. And I think it's really interesting. And then how different it can be between different Muslim groups, because I mean, the religions are always a part of society, and what that society, maybe one society has music as something really important in their culture, and then you use that as a gateway into your spiritual practice. And I could see that in Kurdistan too, how music was used, for example, in different rituals, and it's very different from Sweden. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, so I think it's really interesting. Yeah,
it's also what's so beautiful, I think, about, especially, I mean, it's true for most places, but it's especially true in India, when Sufis encounter many of these yogis, for example, and we see from both sides this like affirmation that we are doing the same thing essentially, right? These practices function often the same way. They have the same goal, and how practices seem to be adopted from each other. So one example that I often bring up is Dara Shikoh, who was a great Mughal prince in India, who was also a dedicated Sufi in the Qadiri Sufi order. And he writes this book called The Compass of Truth, is one way of translating it, where he outlines the Sufi practices that he does as part of his Qadiri path. And one of them is this practice of listening for this primeval sound of reality. So the whole thing is that you sit and you listen and you hear the sound, and the more you focus on the sound, the more intense it gets. And he describes the sound as, it can sound like a beehive, as a waterfall, the sort of like a bell going off, different comparisons or descriptions. And then, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've read certain yogic texts where almost identical practice is spoken of, and even the description of the sound is almost identical. It's the beehive, it's the running water, and we find a lot of those kinds of interactions and similarities between traditions, which I think speaks to what you say, is that there is something about certain, if it's breathing techniques or movements of the body, that seems to have these effects on us that clearly work in some way, whatever that may be, right?
Yeah, and everything is, if we're all sourced from one place there, and we have the same remembrance when the practices, because it's so interesting how everything has evolved, and how what a spectrum of both practices, beliefs, philosophies, and everything is so connected. I did like this comparison with Sufism and Kabbalah, for example, as well, and found many links. So it's not, even if it would be so far apart in the world, we see so many similarities and different ways of explaining these things. And I love, actually, I've read some, I have my bookshelf here, I've read some books from Sufi practitioners. One is The Way of Mary by Camille Halimsky. It's a very big book which connects, they are part of a Sufi tradition, also connected to Rumi's that whole tradition, and she connects the stories of Mother Mary from like all the three Abrahamic traditions, and then connected to Rumi's writings. It's very beautiful. And also, I think I have another book that is, it's by female imam. She's based in Indonesia now. It's called The Quran and Women. So it's really interesting, the interpretations from like how when you interpret things from a specific lens, how it can turn out. And I feel like Sufism is also about that self knowledge and self wisdom and the wisdom of the heart, and that's how I was brought up. So it's a very personal journey. So, and that is also within all traditions true, that either you can have like the focus on something external and maybe at certain points of your spiritual journey you need that, then you need to have that guidance, and then how can you turn it within? And right now I'm reading a new book. It's The Fragrances of the Quran, from a very I don't know if you know.
I recognize the title.
Yeah, it's from this year. It's Jamal Rahman, and it's a really beautiful book, also contemplating quotes and text, and it's like, how do you actually apply it? So it takes, you can have so many different relationships to your practices, to your beliefs, to the divine. And I think it's a beautiful thing that we have also taken part of, like the Sufi traditions, and that you're also sharing what you're finding in your traveling, because I think it's kind of untapped, like on a wide level.
Yeah, in some ways it is. I mean, traveling and seeing these places, it gives you, of course, new perspectives on it. But it also shows that even though, of course, Sufism in this case has been, it's not nearly as prominent in the Islamic world as it was historically. When you go to a place like, I was just in Morocco, for example, like it's everywhere. It's just part of, you walk the streets of Fez and here's a zawiya and they're doing dhikr inside. And then, someone's reciting a Sufi poem on the streets, and, it's just still part of the culture. Same in West Africa, for example. I was there in 2018, and this is Senegal and the Gambia, to be more specific. And there, I haven't looked at the numbers for a couple of years, but back then, this was, again, just a couple of years ago, I think like 95% of the population is Muslim, and like 92% of those Muslims belong to a Sufi brotherhood. So like the vast majority of people in Senegambia are Sufism is part and parcel of their life. So, and that's the way that it worked historically. Whereas other places like, Saudi Arabia, where Wahhabism is very prominent, and I'm using the term Wahhabism, this is not a term that they like themselves, and I don't want to be disrespectful toward them, but it's just the most common term that I think people know, so that's why I use it. But there, Sufism is there are Sufis, but they're not really out in the open, for example. And so it shows how how Islam can be very different in different regions, depending on various different factors, among them Sufism. And that also influences and affects the way that people relate to their religion, how they practice their religion, how they, for example, read the Quran. Do they read it only for the exterior, clear, like literal meanings, or are they diving into the depths of the text that the Sufis historically have pointed to? Ibn Arabi, again, is one of those examples, is that he's interesting because he actually reads the Quran very literally, almost hyper literally sometimes. And my friend Omid Safi likes to point this out, that there's a verse I forget the surah and the verse, but it says, enter in, my servants, and enter into my garden. And you can read that in two ways. And the most obvious reading of that is enter into my garden. But that's only based on a sort of English adding of a comma there. Ibn Arabi, for example, he reads that hyper literally to say, enter in my servants, enter into my servants, enter into yourselves. And that is where my garden, my paradise is, right? And so even something like that is only possible if you have a certain way of approaching Islam and the Quran that is so, prominent in Sufism, for example.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I did a year of with this group of Sufi practitioners based in the US. I did like a year of like self-study through a lot of like the texts from Rumi, but different contemplative practices. And I think that's beautiful. And if anyone is interested, how could they, if they're interested to read more about this, maybe, I mean, I would definitely recommend your channel for those who are interested in learning more about the history and the practices and getting that background. And do you have any books that you would recommend for people, or any meditations or anything that people can start with?
Good question. There are a lot of good books. The classic one is by Anne-Marie Schimmel, The Mystical Dimensions of Islam. It's a couple of decades old at this point, but I think it still holds up. That's a sort of academic introduction. Mm-hmm. I really like, it's a book by Alexander Knish. I think it's called Islamic Mysticism, A Short History or something. Unfortunately, it's published by Brill, which means you're going to have to sell your whole house to afford it. Mm-hmm. But I think what I would recommend is to read some Sufi literature, because that is really, for a lot of people, where the beauty is that draws them in. And so to read Rumi, or to read The Conference of the Birds by Attar, is probably a very good place to start, because you get, it's incredible poetry. So for Rumi, there are a lot of false Rumi quotes out there on the internet, a lot of bad translations, but translations that don't really represent the original intent of Rumi. Coleman Barks is a very popular translator, and his translations of Rumi are very beautiful. They're very poetically pleasing, but they can sometimes stray a lot from Rumi. So if you want to read Rumi, I would recommend Asnavi, of course, and maybe either the translations by Mujaddidi or Alan Williams. I would also recommend reading Fariduddin Attar's Conference of the Birds. This is one of the great classics of Persian Sufi poetry, and it's this epic poem about, as the title suggests, it's the journey of these birds to find the king of the birds, called the Simur. And there's a beautiful translation by Dick Davis. I think it's published by Penguin, that I highly recommend. It's an incredibly beautiful rhyming translation. So that would be my suggestion, is to find some of that literature itself. And often those books of translations of that literature have great introductions that will go through the tradition and explain some of the concepts. That approach has been helpful to me. So I hope that's a satisfactory.
Yeah, I think it's great, and your videos are so beautiful. So I would definitely recommend to visit Filip's Let's Talk Religion channel on YouTube, and you have your Instagram. It's Filip Holm, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I'll link to that in the show notes for anyone who is interested. And I want to really thank you so much for sharing today. There was so much interesting topics, and I have so many more questions, so maybe there will be a follow-up episode. There's so much to talk about.
I'd love to.
So thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who's listened.
Thank you. Thank you so much.